My family lied to help my ex take my son. Now they're begging for help after she turned on them. But I have their confessions recorded. I'm 32, male, and a construction worker from a small town. I'm a single dad, or at least I was until 3 years ago. My son T is 7 now. Smart kid, kinda quiet, loves dinosaurs, and those stupid YouTube videos with kids playing with toys. He's the best thing that ever happened to me, but I haven't seen him in nearly a year. I'll get to that, but first, let me start from the beginning. It was me and Kay, my ex. We were together for about 5 years, married for 2. Things went south pretty fast after T was born. She was restless, complaining about feeling trapped, like her life was over because of the baby. I tried to help out more. I'd come home from 12-hour shifts covered in dirt and sweat, and immediately grab T, trying to give her a break, but she still wasn't happy. One day, out of nowhere, she told me she wanted a divorce. It hit me like a brick to the face. I didn't understand it. She had no reason, no explanation that made sense. Just said she couldn't do it anymore and wanted out. I begged her to reconsider, not for me, but for T. But she was cold about it, like she had already decided long before that conversation. When it came to the custody battle, I assumed it'd be straightforward. I was a good dad, always there, and T was my world. But then things got ugly. Kay started making accusations, saying I was emotionally unstable, that my temper was unpredictable. She even hinted that I could be violent, which was absolute garbage. But the worst part? My own parents. My family sided with her. I'll never forget sitting in that courtroom, watching my mother and father take the stand, saying that Kay was right, that I wasn't fit to be a father. My dad said something like, "We love our son, but he's not ready for the responsibility of raising a child." And my mom? She cried like some damn actress and talked about how she was worried about T's safety with me. I couldn't breathe. It felt like my world was crashing down. My own parents, the people who were supposed to have my back, were throwing me under the bus. And for what? To protect her? To protect their image? They'd always been about appearances, about what other people thought. I realized right then that I was nothing more than an inconvenience in their perfect little world. Long story short, Kay got full custody and I got weekends. But it didn't last long. Every time it was my weekend, there'd be some excuse. "Oh, T's sick," or "We've got plans, maybe next weekend." Before I knew it, she was filing for a restraining order, claiming I'd threatened her. And with my parents backing her up, there was nothing I could do. The judge believed them. They said I had an anger problem, that I needed therapy before I could see my son again. Therapy, right? Like sitting in a room talking to some stranger was going to fix what was happening. I lost custody, completely. No more weekends, no more birthdays, nothing. I couldn't even call him. Kay made sure of that. And my parents? They went right back to acting like everything was normal, inviting me over for family dinners, acting like they hadn't just destroyed my life in court. I stopped talking to them after that, cut them off completely. Fast forward to last year. I was doing everything I could to get my life back together. I'd started saving up for a lawyer to try and fight for joint custody when something strange happened. My mom called me out of the blue, saying she needed to talk. I hadn't spoken to her in almost a year, so I was suspicious. But something in her voice told me this wasn't just another attempt at family peace. It felt urgent, like she was desperate, so I agreed to meet them at their house. My dad was there too, pacing around the living room like he was nervous, which immediately set off alarms in my head. My parents are never nervous. They're always in control, always putting on that calm, composed front. But this time, they looked scared. That's when they told me. Kay had screwed them over. Apparently, after the custody battle, Kay had gotten really close to my parents. They'd let her and T move into a house they owned, rent-free, under the guise of helping her get back on her feet. And now, Kay had turned on them. She was suing them for some bogus claim, saying they promised her the house as a gift. They'd already sunk thousands into legal fees trying to fight her, and it wasn't looking good. I remember sitting there, listening to all of this, feeling this cold, hollow sensation in my chest. They were asking for my help. My help? The same people who had taken my son from me, destroyed my reputation, and left me to rot. I stared at them. These two people I used to love, and I didn't feel a damn thing for them anymore. You think I can help you? I asked, my voice flat, emotionless. After what you did to me. My dad had the audacity to act offended, like he couldn't believe I wouldn't drop everything to come to their rescue. My mom started crying, of course. She always cried when she didn't get her way. She said something about how family sticks together, how we need to let go of the past and move forward. I almost laughed in her face. But then an idea hit me. A dark, twisted idea. I had been recording the entire conversation. I don't know why I'd started doing it, but after the custody battle, I stopped trusting people, especially my family. Something told me to record that meeting, just in case. So I leaned back in my chair and I said, "Why don't you tell me exactly what happened in court?" Huh. Why did you side with Kay? Why did you lie? My mom looked at my dad, and he looked at the floor. They started fumbling over their words, talking about how Kay had manipulated them, how they thought they were doing the right thing at the time. But now they see how wrong they were. They admitted it all. Every lie. Every betrayal. They confessed that Kay had convinced them I was dangerous, but they didn't really believe it. They just didn't want to risk losing access to T. I had everything on tape. Their confessions, their apologies, their pathetic excuses. And the entire time, I sat there pretending to listen, while inside I was calculating, plotting. When they were done, I stood up, told them I needed to think about whether I'd help them or not, and walked out. I could hear my mom sobbing behind me, but I didn't care. I drove home that night, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Power. For the first time since losing T, I was in control. I had leverage, and I was going to use it. Over the next few weeks, I met with a lawyer. I explained everything. How I had been framed. How my parents had betrayed me. How Kay had manipulated everyone. I played him the recording, and he just shook his head in disbelief. He said it wasn't going to be easy, but with that recording, I had a shot at reopening the custody case. And then came the hard part. Confronting Kay. I waited until the day of the hearing. She had no idea I was coming. I walked into the courthouse, saw her sitting there, looking smug and confident like she always did. She had no clue that her entire world was about to crumble. When the judge called the case, I stood up, handed my lawyer the recording, and let him do the rest. Kay's face turned white as a sheet when she realized what was happening. My parents were there too, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. But I didn't care about them anymore. This wasn't about them. This was about T. The judge listened to the recording. He heard my parents admitting to lying in court, heard Kay's manipulation laid out in their own words. And then, for the first time in years, I saw hope. I saw a path back to my son. The court ruled in my favor. Joint custody. I'd get to see T again, to be part of his life. Kay lost her mind in the courtroom, screaming about how unfair it was, how I didn't deserve to be a father. But for once, nobody was listening to her. When it was all over, my parents tried to talk to me, tried to apologize again. But I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need anything from them anymore. I told them they were dead to me, and I meant it. Now, I've got T back in my life. It's not perfect. We've got a lot to work through, but it's a start. As for Kay and my parents, they're dealing with the consequences of their actions. And me? Well, I've learned my lesson. Trust is fragile, and family doesn't always mean loyalty. The first few weeks after the hearing were awkward, to say the least. T barely knew me anymore. He was a different kid than the one I used to tuck into bed at night. He was quieter, more distant. I'd ask him about his day, and I'd get one-word answers. He barely made eye contact. It was like he didn't trust me, and that hurt more than I'd expected. And who could blame him? He'd spent years being fed lies, seeing me as the villain, probably hearing all sorts of things from Kay. I had to remind myself that he was just a kid, confused, caught in the crossfire of a war he didn't ask to be part of. But even knowing that, It still stung every time he flinched when I tried to give him a hug or asked if he wanted to go play catch. The first time I got him for a weekend after the ruling, we spent most of the time just sitting in silence. I didn't want to push him, didn't want to force anything. I thought maybe he just needed time to adjust. But I could feel the distance, this wall between us. It wasn't just him adjusting to me. It was me adjusting to the fact that I'd missed out on so much. I wasn't there for the birthday parties, the first day of school, the scraped knees, the late-night nightmares. I'd been erased from his life, and now I had to rebuild that bond from scratch. I took him to the park, to a pizza place I remembered he used to love, but he barely touched his food. He just stared out the window most of the time, and I kept catching him looking at his phone like he was waiting for a message from his mom. That's when I realized it wasn't just about us anymore. Kay still had her claws in him. Every time I picked him up, I could feel her influence lingering in the background, poisoning whatever fragile relationship we were trying to rebuild. And then there was my parents. They kept trying to get back in my life, kept calling, leaving messages about how they wanted to move forward and heal as a family. I ignored every single one. I was done with them. Completely. It wasn't anger anymore. It was this cold, numb indifference. They made their choice and I made mine. They weren't part of my world anymore, and I wasn't about to let them get close enough to hurt me again. But they didn't stop. They tried sending gifts to T too. Birthday presents, Christmas cards, even a couple of emails through Kay's account asking to see him. At first, I didn't say anything to him about it. I didn't want to drag him into the middle of my drama. But after a few months, he started asking questions. He wanted to know why he wasn't allowed to see Grandma and Grandpa anymore, why they weren't coming around like they used to. I didn't know how to explain it to him. How do you tell a 7-year-old that his grandparents betrayed his dad in the worst possible way? How do you explain that kind of betrayal, that kind of heartbreak, to a kid who just wants things to go back to normal? I ended up telling him something vague about how they weren't safe people to be around, that they'd made some bad decisions. He didn't understand, of course, but he stopped asking for a while. Things with Kay weren't any easier. She hated that I'd won, hated that I was back in T's life, and she wasn't subtle about it. Every time we had to exchange him for weekends, she'd make some snide comment, like, "I hope you've been to therapy. God knows he'll need it after a weekend with you," or, "Don't get used to this. I'll make sure it's temporary." I tried to ignore her at first, but it wore me down. One weekend, after she made some crack about me not being able to keep a job, because of course she had to bring that up, I snapped. Right there in front of T, I told her she was a manipulative liar, that everything bad that happened to our son was her fault, that she was the reason he was so confused and miserable. And then I saw T's face. The look on his face when he watched his parents screaming at each other, hurling insults back and forth like he didn't even exist. He looked scared. Worse than that, he looked like he didn't understand why the two people who were supposed to care for him couldn't even stand to be in the same room together. After that, I promised myself I'd never lose my temper in front of him again. I'd let Kay win those little battles, because it wasn't worth traumatizing him any more than he already was. But keeping that promise, it wasn't easy. One weekend, Kay dropped T off late, almost an hour after she was supposed to. When I asked why, she just shrugged and said he wanted to stay with me longer. Like it was nothing, like she wasn't violating the custody agreement. And I couldn't even get mad, because when I looked at T, he nodded, like he agreed with her, like he wanted to be with her more than me. I felt like I was losing him all over again, like every step forward we made was followed by 2 steps back. I kept showing up for him, kept doing everything I could to prove that I was a good dad. But the truth? The truth was, I wasn't sure if I was ever going to win him back completely. And then came the real kicker. It was a Saturday. T was over for the weekend, and we were playing video games. He was finally starting to relax around me, starting to open up a bit, when he casually mentioned something about Mom's friend. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kay had always had friends over, people I didn't know. But then T started talking more about this friend, how he stayed over a lot, how sometimes he'd make them dinner, how they'd all gone to the zoo together last week. That's when it clicked. Kay wasn't just moving on. She'd replaced me. This friend wasn't just some guy hanging around. He was becoming a part of T's life in ways I hadn't been able to. And T? He liked the guy. He talked about him like he was this fun, cool new addition to their little family. And it broke me. I didn't say anything to T at the time. I didn't want to make him feel guilty, but inside, I was boiling. I'd lost so much already, and now it felt like I was losing even more. Like I was being erased from my own son's life, replaced by some stranger. I wanted to confront Kay, to tear into her about how she was trying to take T away from me in every possible way. But I knew it wouldn't help. She'd just turn it around on me, make me look like the crazy, jealous ex again. So I kept quiet. I buried it deep down, like I had with everything else. But that night, after T had gone to bed, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the walls, and it hit me. This was my life now, fighting for scraps of time with my son, dealing with Kay's games, watching someone else slide into the role I used to have. And no amount of legal victories or recordings or courtroom battles was going to change that. I guess the moral of the story is, sometimes even when you win, you lose. Sometimes the damage is done, and there's no going back to the way things were. But I keep showing up for T. I keep fighting for whatever moments I can get with him, because I have to believe it's worth it. I have to believe that in the end, he'll see through all the lies and manipulation and know who really has his back. As for my parents, I haven't spoken to them since the day of the hearing. They're still out there, still trying to worm their way back in, but I've made my choice. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. So that's where I'm at. It's not a happy ending, but it's my reality. And honestly, I'm just trying to make the best of what I've got left. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking with me. Maybe hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more about how my disaster of a life unfolds next. Who knows, maybe I'll even throw in a happy story one day. But don't hold your breath. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. So please leave a comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories like this one.